This is a series of short presentations that describe a practical approach to managing risk. And this is the second module that concerns the involvement of stakeholders in the risk management process. This step of the risk management process is called communication and consultation in ISO 31000, but essentially is concerned with involving stakeholders during decision making and its aftermath. The risk management process necessarily involves stakeholders, people, because their interests are inevitably part of the organisation's objectives, and they also are concerned with taking appropriate actions, or maybe not taking those actions, in order to modify risk and deal with uncertainty as part of the actions that follow a decision. Also, people have much knowledge and information which the risk management process relies upon and which it must obtain to ensure that their decisions are properly founded and any subsequent actions are properly based. And finally, some people, invariably those people outside the organisation in a regulatory position, might have a right to be informed or consulted, and those stakeholders also need to be considered as part of the process. Stakeholders can be a very wide and disparate bunch. They can, of course, include people within an organisation, its employees and management, and if it is a listed company, its shareholders. It can involve those people who work with the organisation but are not necessarily employees. For example, their partners and contractors and subcontractors. Stakeholders, of course, also involve people in the local community who may live near, such as those people living near a mine site, or could be regulatory licensing approval authorities. It can be our customers. Of course, when we think about stakeholders, we often think about the government and community leaders who have particular interests, and I think we also are especially concerned with special interest groups such as native owners or environmental pressure groups, heritage groups and so on, who, unless we take them into account, can actually be quite difficult to deal with in terms of decision making and progress for the organisation. The way we consider stakeholders as part of the risk management process is that we systematically and constructively consider each stakeholder, we group them together, and we think particularly of their objectives. Not our objectives for them, but their objectives. This template is typical of the device that we might use to brainstorm the stakeholders, then group them together in terms of common objectives. And as I said before, it is their objectives that matter, because often risk arises because we have certain objectives and our stakeholders have different objectives, and it's the difference between those that gives rise to risk. The third column in this template is also useful because we can start to anticipate at this time their communication needs. Not what we wish to tell them, but how they wish to be involved in the decision-making process that we're engaged upon. Of course, we can just brainstorm the three columns here based on our existing knowledge, but invariably that's much better. It is much better if we do some research. We may even ask the stakeholders themselves what are their objectives and how they wish to be involved in this process of making decisions, so that we can reflect their wishes in this type of analysis. The third column in that template leads to a communication plan. And whatever form of risk you are managing and whatever type of decisions you are faced, it's always worthwhile considering how practically you will involve stakeholders in that process. And that invariably is through some form of communication. We need to think of what we're trying to achieve in the communication. Remembering, of course, that communication is a two-way process. We need to hear them as well as speak to them. We need to think specifically who needs to be included in the activity and the groups they represent. We may need to draw upon the expertise and knowledge of certain specialists, and we may need to group together a team to resolve the uncertainty that we've anticipated and move ahead. And particularly, we'll always need to take into account their perspectives on what we propose to do. It's also worthwhile to consider the communication methods that we will adopt at each part of the process. Not every stakeholder will be content with us sending the results of, for example, a risk assessment to them. Many will want to be practically involved, many will want to hear firsthand what's taken place, and a written report is just not sufficient. Whatever method we propose to use, and those methods may change throughout the risk management process, it's also important that we identify how we evaluate the effectiveness of the communication, whether we are hearing what they say and also they're appreciating what we are communicating to them. So my tips and tricks for communication are that we should identify stakeholders at the very start of the process, not as we used to do at the end when we wanted to send the results or send the report. We shouldn't guess at how they feel and what they're trying to achieve. We should ask them, or at least do some research. And in my experience, involvement pays off very significantly. Any form of risk management exercise without stakeholder involvement is, quite frankly, pointless. This is very much about turning them from a problem into part of the solution. Having some form of written communication plan, even if it's very simple, is invaluable. Of course, once we have the plan, we should also follow it. One final tip is it's important as we go round the risk management process to return to our stakeholders, particularly as part of the monitor and review, to thank them for their contributions earlier in the day, earlier in the process, and to tell them what were the outcomes. That is a way of ensuring that they have ownership of those outcomes and also ensuring that they will be there to help us in the future if we need it. So what we've learnt in this module is that the risk management process starts and ends and in fact continuously involves the involvement of stakeholders through communication and consultation. It's therefore important that we start the whole process by understanding who those stakeholders are, what are their objectives, and how they would wish us to communicate with them. Remember, risk is always relative. It's about a perception, a point of view. We may perceive a level of risk to be very low, but if certain stakeholders perceive it to be very high, then we certainly have a very high level of risk. The other thing which we've learned in this module is all of this should resolve in terms of a communication plan or an engagement plan, if you wish, which we should follow, even if it's very simple, to ensure that stakeholders are appropriately involved throughout the process.